adults with MS. Okay. Probably. I got my mail.
You want to get her?
Hello, Sierra. No ways to sail stay.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Wise. I'm the chapter president for the Greater Carolinas for the National Multiple Society, and we are thrilled to bring this event back and be back in person. It's been since 2019 with COVID and all the things, so we're really happy to be here today. I wanted to start off by recognizing a few key people. Without their help, this would not be possible today. So if you're a member of the planning committee, if you could just raise your hand, and if we could recognize them, this group is I also want to give a shout out to Michelle Witherspoon and Denise Bell. They were involved since the very beginning, 20 years ago. We're hearing from a lot of them today, but just so thankful for your partnership. I also want to recognize we have two members of our Board of Trustees with us. I'm not sure if they're in the room still, but Tracy Garrick and Denise Marshall. If you are, please raise your hands. Our board is incredible. There's 24 individuals, all volunteers. They work so hard all year round to support the chapter in incredible ways. Next, I just want to thank our staff for being here.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
All right, nice warm reception there. I don't often get to talk to a room full of Black people in my job, so it's always a treat when I do. Thank you to the National MS Society for putting this event on. Thank you all for coming. Happy Saturday to everybody. So I don't know how you all spend your Saturdays, but usually I'm pretty busy catching up on paperwork during the week. A few household errands and chores and stuff like that. And this past weekend was a little bit unusual. I had a little bit more time than I normally do. And so I figured I'd catch up on a little bit of just entertainment and fun and some things that I didn't get a chance to see from the past few weeks and the past few months. So a bunch of people at work, some of the nurses and some even friends and cousins of mine have been talking about this thing they had heard that was really funny and I decided to listen to it. So did anybody hear about this podcast with Shannon Sharp and Cat Williams? Does anybody know what I'm talking about here?
Oh, yes.
How many people do not know what I'm talking about? Okay, there's a few hands there. So just for a little context. So Shannon Sharp is a Hall of Fame football player. And he has a podcast where he talks to celebrities. And Cat Williams is a famous comedian, and he sells out arenas pretty regularly. And so Cat Williams goes on this podcast, and you think it's just going to be a regular interview, and they just kind of talk about, whatever in his life and career. And the whole thing was about 3 hours long. So this is a podcast, I'm doing household chores and stuff. This is just on in the background, but I'm listening to this. And he spends the whole time talking about all the comedians he has a beef with. And he goes through and he probably insulted some of your favorite comedians out there. Just out of curiosity, how many people consider Cat Williams a top 5 comedian right now? So
I would say, yeah.
Third of the audience? Okay. All right. Let's get it. So a few other names. Is there anybody else? Let's say your top 3, top 5. Anybody want to shout out some other names of comedians that you're thinking about?
Jamie Foxx.
Yep.
Oh.
I like that.
Steve Harvey. Did you hear the podcast? Yeah. So it's a lot of familiar names here. Actually, I think probably so he had a few words to say about Steve Harvey. He had a few words to say about some other people, Ricky Smiley, and who else? Cedric the Entertainer, some other folks and whatnot.
Kevin Hart.
Anyway, if you have a spare 3 hours, can listen to that podcast at some point and be entertained. But if we go back to the legacy of some of the comedians that you all just named, actually. Some of the names that got thrown out there. I didn't hear anybody mention Chris Rock. Chris Rock was somewhere in there too. So, Cat Williams, of course, love him or hate him, he's like a very, very successful comedian, and he has a legacy that goes back through many comedians before him. So, we've got a few generations in the room. We can go back through Cat Williams, Chris Rock, Eddie Murphy was mentioned. How about before Eddie Murphy? Let's go back. Eddie Murphy, let's say the 80s or so.
Richard Pryor. Mm-hmm.
Richard Pryor, okay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, Red Fox.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bernie, shout out to Bernie. Yep.
Yeah,
Red Fox, yep. D.L. Hughley. I see some skepticism from some people. Okay. So the reason I bring this up, and like I said, we can go back, further in that legacy. I didn't hear Dick Gregory, but he would be in there. Dick Gregory, Paul Mooney, there's plenty of others. The reason I was going back through this sort of legacy here is that we can get back to Richard Pryor, and I'm not sure how many people in the audience know, but some people may be familiar that he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, one of the great things about comedy that I love, or just in general, there's some people that just tell jokes, they tell a few jokes, they're hot for a couple of years, and then they kind of fade away. Mm-hmm. But the great comedians really kind of take their life experience and they'll talk about it, and they can take situations that might seem tragic and they can find some humor in it, or they can have some perspective on it. And even if it seems kind of tough to deal with, they can help people kind of get through situations, or at least understand situations better. And so I'm going to take a little bit of a risk this morning. I've done this once at a scientific talk, and it was kind of a closed group. There was a few people in there that I figured I could get away with this. So we have a family event today here, and I'm going to take a little bit of a risk, but I'd like to share with you a little bit of what Richard Pryor has to say about multiple sclerosis. And then we'll talk a little bit about his life and kind of tie that into the diagnosis of MS and how we look at managing this. So just for context, he was born in 1940, diagnosed in 1986. And in his later years, some of his stand-up routines would incorporate parts of his life into this. And he would talk a little bit about his experience. And I'm going to play a small clip from this. Don't worry, part of it is bleeped out, and I didn't share the other part that we can't play here. Let's see if this works. So, did anybody hear that last little bit somebody said from the audience? Make that out for the audio. So a woman yelled out in the audience, she said, "Does MS mess with your sex life?" I'm not going to play what he said after that. But he goes on to talk about the different kinds of symptoms that he experienced. He talked about sexual symptoms. He talked about vision. He talked about trouble with his balance. He talked about mood changes and being irritable at times and kind of not really knowing where that was coming from. And so those are pretty common symptoms for multiple sclerosis, but one of the issues is that, especially when around the time he was diagnosed in his early years, there was this long-standing idea that MS wasn't as common among Black people if it happened at all. Granted, he is, he was a celebrity, and he's doing these multi-million-dollar movies, and obviously, when he's not functioning right, he's got to get his medical care, and people are all sort of invested in figuring out what's going on and whatnot. So he was fortunate to kind of get access and kind of figure things out a little bit. But the prevailing thought in medical literature was that MS didn't really happen in Black people, but if it did happen, it was worse. And so I want to talk a little bit about the context of that and how that applies to diagnosis, because that goes back over a century. So you can still find today, there are these dusty old medical journals. There's one from 1921, and there's this Dr. Davenport at Cold Spring Harbor. That's a laboratory in New York. It's a famous scientific laboratory. And he gave a speech in 1921, and the paper got published in 1922, and that said that MS seemed to be pretty much the same in Black people when it happened, but that it was much less likely to happen because he just didn't really see it a lot in this particular practice and among people. So this is 1920, and obviously there wasn't social media, and this wasn't kind of zipping around through all the different electronic media back then. So you get something written in a medical journal that's by somebody that's reputable, and this just kind of goes throughout all the major institutions, and that's part of the legacy that lasts for a century afterwards. So then from 1920-something through the 30s and 40s, there's this idea that MS really didn't happen that much among Black people. Richard Pryor was born in 1940. And in 1941, there's another old dusty article, but this is from a doctor at Johns Hopkins, a Dr. Cole, who in Baltimore said that, well, I see folks with MS here in Baltimore, and it seems to be pretty much the same in terms of the number of Black people that are getting it and how bad it is, and it doesn't look like it's any different. But that was sort of one paper kind of in the whole ocean of all the other papers that were going around saying that pretty much MS was uncommon among Black people, but worse when it happens. That started to change a little bit probably in the last 10 to 15 years or so. And there was a research paper probably about 10 years ago now, looking at some data from Southern California where they had a really big cohort of people, really a diverse cohort of people. By the way, a lot of the old studies about multiple sclerosis where they were figuring out who has it and making all these determinations, a lot of these were done in military veterans like many decades ago when it was segregated, so there really just weren't that many different types of people to look at. So there are fewer women, obviously, in the military way back when, and then also fewer Black people and fewer people of any other group. And then also over time, when you had these studies, for example, in Southern California, they started looking at diverse cohorts and saying, like, wait a minute, we're seeing MS a lot more than the literature has been saying for the last 60 years. And actually, in Southern California, they were saying that the rates seem to be higher among Black women. There's still a little bit of debate about that in the literature, but the point is, it's not way less. If anything, it's equal and maybe a little bit more, depending on how you slice the data. So I bring that up because a lot of people have had delayed diagnoses for multiple sclerosis, and I would say probably every 3 or 4 months I meet somebody who's in their 60s and they'll say, when I was in my 20s or 30s, I had this little smudge in my vision, I couldn't really see anything quite well, and I went blind in that eye for a couple days, and then it came back and I went to the doctor and they said, that sounds like MS, but it doesn't really happen in Black people, so I'm not sure what that was. You'll probably be all right. And then years pass and then other things happen and then they kind of come to a diagnosis. So that's a very common story, unfortunately. Things are getting better now with some of these papers that have been released about people being more aware about the prevalence of MS in different populations. So that is definitely improving. The question about severity is something that's still being addressed too, because there's 3 different areas where things have seemed to be worse for Black people. So that's clinical signs, biomarkers, and MRI features. So clinical signs just means anything that we can see. So for example, if you go to the doctor and you tell the doctor, hey, I'm having trouble moving my right leg, or the doctor's examining you and they're checking your reflexes and they notice something that's changed now and it's compared to the way it was before, something that's progressing, that's something you can see. So that's a clinical sign. And these things include also things like difficulty walking, vision issues. It's a little bit more common to see people have inflammation in the spinal cord, which can also lead to issues with the arms and the legs, and sometimes with the bladder, sometimes with sexual function, things like that. Biomarkers are things that most people in the room, you don't really need to worry about these so much. It's usually your neurologist that's taking care of these or looking at these for you, but usually in the early stages of diagnosis, some people may have spinal fluid taken and they'll run laboratory tests on that to see if there's signs of inflammation there. So the levels of that seem, at least in some prior studies, seem to be a little bit higher among Black people than in some other groups. And again, these are usually folks that are in the process of being diagnosed or kind of in the early stages where there's lots of relapses. And then that last category was MRI features, where folks are a little bit more likely to have some, so the term lesion, I'm sure many of you have heard that, that's just a generic term for the spots that you see on the MRI that show inflammation. So that if you imagine like looking at a brain in 3D and having a volume for that brain, so the total volume that's taken up by those lesions, if you were to add them up and make a volume, that seems to be a little bit larger for some Black patients. These studies that I'm telling you about, a lot of these were studies that were based on data from years past. It's not so much in the last 10, 20 years necessarily that, let me take a step back. There have been a lot of new advances in treatment over the last 15 to 20 years. So now that people are starting to be on those treatments, there is a lot better chance of folks being able to slow that down. So why is it the case that it seems to be a little bit more severe? Again, there's questions about maybe this is just in the era and you're looking at patients that didn't have the opportunity to get treatment. But there's also thoughts about stress and vulnerability in other areas. So if you have other stressors in your life, and everybody has some degree of stress, but there's particular types of stress whether it comes to living situations, emotional distress, financial distress, kind of your living environment in terms of pollution, things like that. There's a lot of research going into how do we figure out what are those triggers that make it more likely for people to have inflammation. So there's theories about that, but not really hard data on that just yet. The late diagnosis issue is one that is really important to me because I meet a lot of people who either, like I said before, they tell me a story and it seems like they got things figured out a little bit later than ordinarily we would have liked. Or you have folks that are early on and they have this window of opportunity where we're making the diagnosis and it's a really frightening situation. But at the same time, it's really an opportunity because back in the day, people would discover when it was oftentimes too late to do anything about it. Now these days, you get in a fender bender car wreck and you go to the emergency room, somebody scans your head and they say, maybe there's something there, and then people are showing up and getting scans done for a lot of reasons, a lot faster than they used to. So that is, it is promising that we have a little bit more awareness of the fact that MS is more prevalent among Black people than originally thought. And the treatments are a lot better for it than the situation used to be. So I'll just round out a little bit more about Richard Pryor's life here, just so for context, when we think about his story and think about what he shared about his symptoms. So I was telling you about all that stuff in the 1920s where there's this idea that MS isn't as common among Black people. He's born in 1940. He was diagnosed in 1986, so he is 46 years old at that time. Most people with MS start experiencing symptoms in their 20s and 30s. So a little bit of a delay for him in that sense. By the way, MRIs didn't become available until 1983, for context there too. So he's diagnosed 3 years after MRIs even become available. MS treatment, so the very first one, the interferon drugs, the very first one got approved in 1993. So he didn't have the opportunity for most of his life to have treatment or to even recognize that something was going on, except for things getting significant enough for him to feel symptoms. So that's one aspect of it. And then as far as MS treatments, if you get a bunch of neurologists in the room and kind of have them being candid, a lot of them will say, a lot of us will say, I'll just speak for myself, I won't put anybody else into this, but we'll say that a lot of the MS treatments didn't really start becoming very, very effective probably until the early 2000s. And Richard Pryor died in 2005. He didn't die from MS, he died with MS. He actually, some of you that are familiar with his career and his life know that he lived a hard life. He was on the road, touring, some drug use, but the other thing was just cardiovascular issues, and so he died from a heart attack. Cardiovascular issues, it was not MS. But one of the reasons I want to share his story is just because I love his comedy, but also just in terms of his life story, that's kind of a good timeline of how just in, one generation, 2 generations or so, you kind of see how we're going from this idea of MS not really being something that people thought happened to Black people to having a little more data that supported that, at least to the kind of general medical establishment, to, fortunately in some senses, too late for his situation. But we now live in a time where people have, like I said, there's all these opportunities to, first of all, show up and get a diagnosis, and then have disease-modifying treatment started fairly early on to try to get things in check before new symptoms become too entrenched to really do anything about. So I will stop there. There's plenty of time for questions. I'll be around for a little bit after this session here. But it's really good to see everybody out here. Like I said, I don't usually see 50 Black people in one place for my particular line of work here. So it's good to see everybody, and I'm happy to talk to you and answer any questions. So thank you.
And we're very proud of it. It's our baby, right? We are so excited that the MS Society continues to keep investing in this conference. As Janelle said when she was up here, we had to adjust it because COVID took us all down. But I'm hoping that many of you have attended the Blak MS experience. You might see myself and Tyler Campbell on that. We're the host of that. And that was a great experience for us because we were able to take this information global. So there's people all over the world of color that can join that conference. So we're really excited about that. So thank you, Shonda. Thank you for Denise for continuing to show up 20 years in. We try to make this a community event. So I'll be the moderator for this discussion if y'all haven't figured that out yet. So we brought this conference together because we wanted Black people to talk to other Black people around what it's like living with this disease. I have MS. My sister has MS. Where is she? Right there. My aunt has MS. My mom's middle sister. And so we're an MS family. And this event has been something that our family comes to every year. So we hope that you continue to grow. Bring your sisters, your aunties, your uncles, your friends, because you need to build community when you're living with this disease, okay? So this is what this is about. All right, so today we're gonna talk about advocacy. That's gonna be the purpose of this panel today. We're gonna talk about advocacy, we're gonna talk about disease-modifying drugs, and we're gonna talk about patient advocacy. What can you do as both the patient and the caregiver? But I'm gonna start off with the introduction, so I gotta put my glasses on, right? So I don't mess it up. If I mispronounce something, y'all just forgive me, okay? So first, we want to thank Dr. Kimbrough for staying. We don't always have neurologists that stay, by the way. They do that a little bit, then they dip, right? So we appreciate that you're here, that you're staying with us. He's gonna stay a little bit after this panel as well, so he can answer some questions that you may have. We also have Dr. Janelle Montgomery, and we are so excited you're here because she's just had a new baby, so she gotta get up here, talk, and then she's gonna leave, okay? So y'all don't stop her on the way out. She gotta get back to the baby. She's a clinical pharmacist practitioner with Duke Neurology Clinic. She received her Doctor of Pharmacy degree from UNC Elshman School of Pharmacy. She has completed pharmacy residency programs with Vivid Medical Center and New
Hanover Regional Medical Center. Dr. Montgomery has worked with the MS and neuroimmunology, did I say it right? Say it for me. You got it. At Duke since 2016. Her primary role includes providing medication education and coordination for patients on disease-modifying therapies and symptomatic medications. We're really excited you're here because you know we're going to be asking a lot of questions. All right. Then we have Tracy. Tracy's there on the end. Tracy is a native Carolinian, South Carolinian. Sorry, you want me to put the South in there. I know you're in North Carolina now. Committed to his beliefs and steadfastly encouraging others to do the same. He was diagnosed with MS in 2001. Tracy joined the National MS Society's Greater Carolina Board of Trustees in 2022, where he currently serves as a co-chair of the Upstate Community Council and supports the MS Society in his local community as a MS ambassador. Tracy often connects one-on-one with newly diagnosed patients to help support them as they navigate through their MS journeys. So welcome, Tracy. Thank you for being here. He's awesome. I got to meet him. We sat on the board together, but then I left the board when he joined. Unfortunately, our scheduled caregiver had a death in the family, and so we're sending them positive energy where they are. But in their place, we have Shania Witherspoon. Shania is there. Shania is a second-year medical student at the University of South Carolina School of Medicine, Greenville. She received her master's in biomedical sciences from Duke School of Medicine and a bachelor's in biology from USC Charlotte. She's a National Health Service Corps scholar and a recent graduate of the National Medical Fellows Primary Care Leadership Program. Both of these programs are geared toward training the next generations of physicians to serve marginalized communities and address healthcare disparities. Shania's great aunt, and mom both live with MS, all live with MS. Many of you that have been coming to this conference over the years have seen her because she's my daughter. She's been coming here since she was about 5. All right. Okay, so now we're going to get started. Okay? So we're going to start with DMTs. All right, so for a reminder for all of you, DMTs are disease-modifying therapies. That's our treatments that we have for MS. I'm on Ocrevus or Ocrevus, however you want to pronounce it. You got Tisabri and others. There's 25 DMTs, at least something with you guys on the website. 25 DMTs for MS, all available on the MS Society's website. So if you're wondering what they all are out there, go to the MS Society, they're all there. So I'm going to start with you. Dr. Montgomery, what's happening with DMTs right now today? Can you share any new DMTs coming to the market? Can you give us an overview?
Yes, so I will say since I started in 2016, there's been quite a few new approvals for MS medications and disease-modifying therapies. I think what's happening right now is we're seeing a lot of new generics coming to market and biosimilars as well. So biosimilars are kind of similar to generic medications, but basically they're produced through a different process, and the goal is for them to be similar to medications that are already available. So the most recent one is Tisabri that is coming soon to the market. It's supposed to help with cost is a goal for creating biosimilars. So I think there's going to be a lot of people who are introduced to these new medications and may have questions about, is this similar to what I've been taking before? Will this impact, how much I can afford the medication? So I think that's kind of the latest, greatest thing in regards to how we're transitioning now. When I first started, all the medications were brand name, and now there's just so many different options in terms of generics, and now with the upcoming biosimilars. And I know there's a new class of medications that's being studied, the BTK inhibitors. So those studies are kind of in progress. I know we have new studies that are going on at Duke. So those are kind of the newest things that are new class of medications that might be coming to the market, but it's still kind of being studied right now.
What does that mean, BTK?
It's proven tyrosine kinase inhibitor.
No, but what does it mean to people not smart?
Yes, that's the class of medication, but it's kind of, it works in a similar way as other disease-modifying therapies in that its goal is to kind of decrease inflammation, target this pro-inflammatory, the inflammation that comes with MS. So it's kind of a different way of attacking those, that part of your immune system. So I would say that's a good way to explain it.
Would you say there's a difference between generic and non-generic?
Yes, so I would say there's a difference between generics and biosimilars. So biosimilars go through a more extensive approval process compared to generics. So they have to show the FDA that they're very similar in terms of the molecule of the MS medication, as well as how they function. So they need to be able to act equivalently to the MS medication that you're already taking. So that's what I would say. I think the development process is just more intensive and it kind of works in a different way than the generics do.
Is there a recommendation for a DMT for a certain type of cellular makeup for a person compared to another DMT?
I wouldn't say so. I mean, I would say the DMTs that we have available it really is a personalized decision as to which one works best for you. So I would say it kind of depends on different factors like how you might react to the medication, whether it fits your lifestyle in terms of how it's dosed. So I would say what your options are in terms of choosing like high efficacy medications versus other options should fit how you're able to take the medication. So that's how I would say it's individualized for a person.
So how do you have that conversation around shared decision making when someone's choosing a DMT?
So that's changed a lot over the years because back in the day there weren't that many options to really give for multiple sclerosis. So usually you walk in the door, there's 3 options. Oftentimes they were basically equivalent, and so sometimes doctors would just say, take this one, and that didn't always go over well. But when I'm talking to patients, usually there's probably 2 or 3 different categories. So some people come in and they are very knowledgeable, they've read a lot of stuff about it, maybe they've had an encounter with somebody in the family or somebody else knows about multiple sclerosis. So we come in and have a detailed conversation about the ins and outs, and they're talking about clinical trials and things they've heard and just trying to explain it to them. Some people are the opposite, where they say, look, doc, just tell me what to do and I'll figure it out, I'll do that. Most people are somewhere in the middle, and so on the side of it as an individual seeking treatment, it's really helpful to know what you are mainly concerned about. Like, what are your objectives? There's some people that obviously, everyone wants to have an effective treatment, something that doesn't bother them, and they'll say, I want something with no side effects. Well, there's not such a treatment that doesn't have any side effects. Mm-hmm. So then your doctor will need to know things like, are you terrified of needles? Is your work life so busy that you're not going to remember to take that second pill in the afternoon if you're taking it twice a day? Is it easier for you to do something on your own that you have control of once a month or once every few weeks? Or you don't have time for all that, so you need something that's once every 6 months. So there's all those kinds of nuances that really help people figure out what's the easiest drug for them to take.
But it was on there when I looked a couple weeks ago. Tracy, I'm gonna come to you if you would pass the mic to Tracy, because first of all, will you share what DMT you're on if you're comfortable doing so, and then how did you choose that one?
That's coming out, and the company's looking for people to get on it, to try it out, and it was openness. And our conversation was, she was like, they're going to try it. It's going to be every 6 months. And I dropped the mic. I was like, huh? So you mean tell me I don't have to think about MS every day? I don't have to think about it every week. So when she said openness, I was like, hey, let's go for it. And so.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting when you on breaks and we have time, talk to other people and understand their experience. You're going to find we have so many similarities. How we were diagnosed, how we chose our medication.
Medications, and so it's become a whole, before I went to college and then when I come back to visit, joint effort between me and my dad it's become a whole routine. So like she said, days before, just making sure that she's getting all the pre-medications, so like the Benadryl and all of that stuff in her system. And then the day of, coordinating who's gonna take her to the infusion center and who's gonna pick her up because she's like really exhausted and doesn't drive after. So just making sure you're really active. So that's one thing that we did in her care, to make sure that when she's taking these medications that there's someone there supporting her.
Yeah, it's really important. What about lupus, which always gets, people get, it could be lupus, but it could be MS.
Yeah. So when there are lots of symptoms going on and people are a little bit confused about what's going on, the 3 diagnoses that come up are usually MS, lupus, and fibromyalgia. These can be, this is why we have all of our different testing and MRI scans and such, but most of the time you can tell those apart pretty easily. There's a few cases where it's on the fence and there's a lot of monitoring, but most of the time.
As a patient, if your doctor says, well, it could be lupus, it could be MS, it could be like, as a patient, how do you advocate for yourself in the room? Go, well, can you run this extra test? Like, what should you do in the room besides saying, I don't know about that, and going off and being a Google doctor?
So, this is, that's a good question, because a lot of this comes down to trust. Some people you have friends, colleagues, personal relationships. You ever had there's someone that you're dealing with and they have a task to do and you are invested in the outcome of that task because it matters to you, but you're worried about whether or not they're doing every little thing to make sure they accomplish that, because if they don't get it done, then you pay the price for it, right? That comes down to trust. So if you find yourself sort of like, I have to chase behind this person to double check their work, and did you do this, did you order this, did you do that? Then you get into trust questions there. And that trust does have to be earned over time. So I'm not just saying there's certain things professionally that people are engaged with. So as a physician, when people say, well, why didn't you run the test? Actually, now you'll appreciate this too, probably from your lab diagnosis course. So most tests don't give you the answer. Most tests shift a probability in a direction that informs what you already thought to begin with about something. So just asking for another test, a lot of times physicians will say well, we don't need to order that test. I'm like, well, why not? I need to advocate, I need to get that test because on the internet it says this test does this thing. But there's a whole literature about how suppose you get that test, and then suppose that test is positive, but it's at a low level, and you didn't believe it in the first place. Now your doctor is forced to go on this whole wild goose chase to prove that test didn't matter. And next thing you know, you have to take tests that you ordinarily wouldn't have got that pose some risk to you and do additional scans and on and on and on. So as far as these particular evaluations, to the point about the advocacy piece, I would say what you want to understand is your physicians or whoever it is, you understand their thinking. You're asking questions about how are you conceptualizing this? And then you get an insight into how they're approaching the problem and not telling them how to address the problem by getting a particular test.
Just from a caregiver's perspective, I think just asking questions to your loved one, what do they need, goes a really long way, and sometimes that's all they're looking for. So starting there, and you'll learn a lot more about what's going on and how you can be there for them.
Let me tell you what's next, okay? So your box lunches, Chrissy, are they out in the hallway? Okay, so box lunches will be out in the foyer, but when we come back, there will be 2 breakout sessions. So let me tell you about the 2 so you can choose. On this side of the room, because in a minute they're gonna see that middle part where Chrissy is right there. They're gonna pull a wall through there. There you go, your banner. And so they're gonna pull a wall through. On this side where I am is going to be the MS and the family. Chrissy, did I say that correctly? Okay. Yeah, so on this side of the wall is going to be MS and the family. So that's going to be with Sierra Harrison and her mother, Evelyn, who are amazing. If you guys haven't heard them, they did the virtual MS conference. And so they're a mother and daughter. Sierra was diagnosed with MS in 2016 when she was 25. Evelyn determined to help her daughter out, lift her spirit. She was like, I'm in there, I got you, I'm gonna be the best caregiver you done ever had. And so Evelyn's nursing, Sierra's social work background, they started to engage and serve and educate other families with chronic illnesses. So, and they, like I said, they were on our National MS Conferences virtual now. If you haven't seen that, go to the MS Society, it's still there, and we do that every year. And so they're going to come together and talk about the challenges of being an MS care partner and how do you support. That's going to be on this side of the room.
Bye.